Welcome to another episode of This Month in Mormon Studies, co-sponsored by Kofford Books and the Mormon News Report. My name is Brian Whitney, and I'm joined by my radiant co-host, Brandt Malone.
Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Fantastic. You just got back from Europe.
I did. It was a crazy trip, but it's nice to be back on the soil of freedom.
Hey, and you broke the European Union while you're out there.
I did. Yep.
Fantastic. Tonight we are joined by a special guest, Stephen Smoot from Book of Mormon Central. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to have you on. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and give us the lowdown on what Book of Mormon Central is all about.
So I graduated from BYU about a year and a half ago in Ancient Near Eastern Studies, and I'm heading off to the University of Toronto later this fall for my graduate studies in Near Eastern Studies. And I'm working right now with Book of Mormon Central, as you mentioned. What we're doing is we're centralizing everything about the Book of Mormon: scholarship, cultural history, artifacts. We're trying to catalog this digitally online on an archive we've developed. So that's books, articles, photographs, transcripts of things, paintings, pictures, you name it, music, even videos. We're getting, if it's Book of Mormon, we want it on our website, on our archive. And we're doing digital or social media outreach through, social media, memes, podcasts, videos, short articles, news updates, that sort of stuff, to basically get people jazzed about the Book of Mormon. You can find us online at bookofmormoncentral.org and check us out.
And, of course, we'll link to the Book of Mormon Central on the show notes. And for those who aren't aware of Stephen Smoot, he's also a little bit of a minor celebrity. He once made an appearance on the Conan O'Brien show.
Yes.
We will link to his appearance in the show notes as well.
Yeah, as many people as can see me being humiliated on national TV. That's, primo.
Well, now on to the news. Kofford author and retired Lieutenant Colonel Sherman Fleek received the Secretary of Army Award for Valor in late May after disarming a gunman at an IHOP restaurant in Fairfield, California 1 year ago. In a Deseret News article covering the award ceremony, Fleek said that the gunman was facing away and did not see me. I knew I could take him down, but if I did, perhaps someone would be shot and wounded or even killed. A surge overcame Fleek and he rushed the gunman. In a flash, he realized that 3 decades had passed since he had needed to use his hand-to-hand combat skills learned during Special Forces training. Fleek said he never dreamt that 10 seconds would become one of the most defining aspects of his life.
Not to diminish what he did, because I think that's pretty amazing what he did. How different would this story be if it was happening at a Waffle House versus an IHOP?
That's a good question.
Because I think the IHOP takes it up a level, oh, okay, this was a classy joint he was at. Whereas if it's a Waffle House, we would call that Tuesday afternoon.
Oh, man. So we have the Elder Talmage Journals from 1879 to 1911. This is comprising 12 volumes, and they've all been digitized and are available online at the L. Tom Perry Special Collections Department at the Harold Bealey Library at BYU. These diaries, they include an autobiography of his youth growing up in England, including almost daily entries covering his life from his time as a student at Brigham Young Academy and on through his graduate school and academic career. They also include details about his marriage, his family and professional life, and up to his calling as member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and the Church. And I've actually had a chance to look at these journals, not the digitized version, but the actual journals. I was doing some stuff in special collections while I was at BYU and with a class of mine, and they brought it out for us. And I can say, having looked at them firsthand, Elder Talmage had impeccable handwriting.
From what I remember and from what I've always heard, he was a really diligent journal keeper. So I would just be fascinated to just see the journals that he has, and I'm glad that they're making it available online, so you don't actually have to go physically to the library and see it, just because then you're continuing to open up, and this is really consistent with what the church has been doing, just opening it up and saying, okay, here you go, here's the Talmage Journal, so that you can go through and view it on your own.
All right, so let's talk about a little bit of what's going on with the blogs this month. Stephen?
Oh, sure. So the Interpreter Foundation has posted videos of the keynote address delivered at the 2016 Science and Mormonism Symposium. This was back in March, and Brother Guy Consolmagno, I think you pronounce his name, who's director of the Vatican Observatory and the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation, gave the keynote address. So his video is up there on the Interpreter site, and they also have added videos of their other speakers as well.
John Dinger, editor of the Nauvoo City and High Council Minutes and Significant Textual Changes in the Book of Mormon, published a post with Rational Face titled, "Was Joseph Smith Ever Convicted of a Crime?" And that's a clickbaity post if I've ever seen one,
Right.
Where he looked at the historical record and discovered that, shocking, Joseph Smith had indeed been convicted of assaulting Hancock County tax collector Walter Bagby. Dinger wrote, Joseph Smith, while riding in a buggy, came across Bagby. They had a disagreement, and Bagby called Smith a liar. Smith, enraged, got out of his buggy, and when Bagby saw this, he ran to pick up a rock to presumably defend himself. Before he could even pick up the rock, Smith either struck him multiple times, attempted to strike him, or choked him.
I have to say I'm a little bit disappointed in this. I was really hoping that Joseph Smith would have taken off his white glove one finger at a time and smacked it across Bagby's face. But no, I guess this was an actual brawl. Christopher, a juvenile instructor, wrote about racism in the Utah Jazz. He wrote, there's a common joke among sports fans concerning the Utah Jazz's team's nickname. It's so obvious that it hardly needs to be told. Utah Jazz is a contradiction in terms because nothing could be so absurd as jazz music in Salt Lake City.
Ha ha ha. So let me ask you then, if you could rename the Utah Jazz to encapsulate Utah culture, maybe even a little bit of Mormon culture, what on earth would you possibly name the Utah Jazz?
How about the Utah Saints?
The Utah Saints.
Would that
That's
be
a good one.
On the nose? Or would that, I don't know. It's kind of keeping in the spirit of sort of
the spirit
culture,
of things.
Right?
You bet.
I like that. Okay, so you win right now, Stephen.
All right, hooray!
Christopher Smith over at Worlds Without End wrote a piece titled Early Mormons and Mass Poisoning, which discusses the violent suggestions from Mormons in Far West in retaliation against anti-Mormon mobs. He wrote of a meeting on October 20th, 1838. Quote, Rigdon was an extremist, and his rhetoric had grown more and more violent throughout the Mormons' confrontation with their neighbors. This meeting brought about his worst impulses. Besides monitoring enemy activity, he assigned Captain Amasa Lyman's spy company to clandestinely commit acts of arson against the Missourians in retaliation for the burning of Mormon homes. If necessary, the company should burn down the cities of Richmond, Liberty, and Buncombe, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, the county seats that had dispatched militias to fight the Mormons. Then someone made an even more disturbing suggestion that if arson didn't work, the spy company could poison the Missourians' food supply. I really like Worlds Without End. I've said a few times that might be a bit of hyperbole, but I kind of view them as the Atlantic of Mormon blogging. They do a really good job as far as research goes. I really, really like this one, and I think that period in Missouri is something that it's uncomfortable for us, but there's a lot of context that needs to go into it, and those stories that come out of there are really fascinating.
So back to digitizing efforts, Todd Robbins, the juvenile instructor, has launched a new series titled Digitizania, where he will be highlighting new digital collections from a variety of repositories throughout the world related to Mormon studies. In his first post, he linked to the Lorenzo Brown Diary, the Alice Louisa Reynolds Diaries, and the Orson F. Whitney Papers, among others.
Makes it a lot easier to do research.
Absolutely.
Bridget Jack Jeffries, a Catholic graduate student in religious studies, wrote a fascinating post for Worlds Without End, again, my favorite blog as of the moment, entitled Undoing Mormon Theology as a Non-Mormon, where she discussed her experiences as the first non-Mormon participant in the seminar that is sponsored by the Neal A. Maxwell Institute. She stated, "It is no secret that some Mormons are clannish and innately suspicious of outsiders because of who we are, not what we say," end quote, but that her experiences with Adam Miller and Joseph Spencer, co-organizers of the seminar, have been, quote, beyond welcoming. I've done a few podcasts, I think, in the past with Bridget. I find her to be a fascinating voice as an outsider to Mormonism, and I understand what she's saying, that sometimes we can feel a little suspicious about outsiders that are coming in, but I think that's starting to, as more and more outsiders get interested in Mormon studies, I think that's starting to wane a little bit, and I think one of the things that we're all starting to realize is these outsiders bring a perspective that we can't imagine, whether you're a faithful Mormon or a disaffected Mormon or whatever. We all have our interpersonal views on Mormonism, and so when they come in with this fresh outside perspective, I think it opens up a lot of windows and a lot of different views on how we can view Mormonism and Mormon studies.
Julie Smith at Times and Seasons posted her reaction to Greg Prince's biography of Leonard Arrington. Julie made this clear that this was not a review of the book, but rather how the book affected her on a personal level. She wrote, "In short, it depressed me." She went on to say, "Here's what happens to Arrington. He gets permission from the First Presidency to do something as church historian. He does it. People, probably CES people, complain to a member of the 12. That member of the 12 raises the complaint, and Arrington gets reined in. To put simply, infuriating. Nonetheless," she continued, "things have really changed a lot and quickly."
To your point, Brian, you look at all the things that are now starting to happen and the wheels that are in motion within the church and really starting to open up these things, and it's almost night and day compared to what was happening in the late 70s and early 80s versus what's happening now in 2016. Ben Park, at the Juvenile Instructor, posted Reassessing Robert Flanders' Nauvoo Kingdom on the Mississippi 50 years later. He wrote, "One of the first books on Mormon history to be published by University Press, it was preceded by, among others, Leonard Arrington's Great Basin Kingdom, and was a very early academic treatment that inaugurated the new Mormon history movement. It also still reads remarkably well. but of course it wears the marks of age. In this post, Ben highlighted not only the strengths and weaknesses of this classic, but also some historiographic developments in the past half century. The amazing thing about 2016 and the internet is, A, I can go and find all of the best book awards that MHA has handed out and all these different archives of awards, and B, I can go on Amazon and I can buy the book for $4. And so my wife is really sick of me. I've been buying all the MHA Best Book Award winners, and so we've been getting like a different book every week. The fact that this stuff is still out there is really good, but also I think it's important that we have people like Ben that are going through and reassessing it, because it was influential for its time, but like you said, it shows the marks of age, and that's not a bad thing. But it's also important to reevaluate and say, okay, here's where it succeeds, here's where it falls short, and then here's where you should go from here, whether you should continue reading or maybe supplant it with this other book.
Now, Robert Flanders was to the Community of Christ, of course, back then it was the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was to them what Leonard Arrington was to us. He was sort of their preeminent historian. For the Mormon History Association to give their first award in 1965 to an RLDS historian was a major bridge-building effort. And Flanders got a bit of flack for it because he was fairly candid about things like polygamy. And this was at a point when the RLDS Church was not ready to accept that Joseph Smith was a practicing polygamist.
Speaking about polygamy, we have Meg Stout at Millennial Star, who's offering a free PDF download of her book, Joseph Smith, Reluctant Polygamist, published by Millennial Press. It's a 386-page book with 20 chapters and 4 appendices that details Joseph Smith's participation in polygamy from the standpoint of non-sexual relationships. And so if you're interested in checking out her work, you can find a link to download the PDF version of the book in the show notes. You can also find it at the millennialstar.org website. You know, when it comes to Meg Stout's treatment, there's a lot that I disagree with her on and that others are going to disagree with her on. But I think she's made an important contribution in a couple of ways. First of all, I think it's great that we're having more women participating in this conversation. She's not really a professional historian. She's sort of an independent researcher. But it's great that we're getting her perspective and her feedback on this. You know, this is a very gendered issue, understandably, and it's been dominated by male voices, I think, for too long. And so it's at least great, I think, that we have more women participating in this discussion about Mormon polygamy and getting it from her perspective. Even if you don't agree with everything that she says, I still think it's valuable to check out in that regard.
Dwayne Boyce, author of Even Unto Bloodshed, an LDS Perspective on War, published an article with Interpreter titled The Ammonites Were Not Pacifists, where he takes on the common perception of the Ammonites as a model for pacifism. He writes, "It is widely thought that the Ammonites' rejection of war was a total renunciation of conflict as a matter of moral principle, but argues that, quote, not only did the Ammonites permit the Nephites to kill the Lamanites in their place, and not only did they seek to enter the war that was then being waged, but they also provided material support to the Nephite armies in these very military efforts." This is a provocative article that I'm sure will not go unchallenged. But again, just like Meg Stout's work, it's worth the read, and it's worth having your ideas challenged on these things.
Jenna Reese posted on Flunking Statehood about an attention-grabbing article by Fiona Givens recently published by Dialogue titled The Perfect Union of Man and Woman that presents 3 very strong arguments. 1, Joseph intended the Relief Society to give women a role that was collaborative with male priesthood. 2, Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother co-preside. And 3, ancient traditions and some early Mormon traditions associated Heavenly Mother with the Holy Spirit. For an author whose work is published by Deseret Book, these are strong statements. Jana posted a Q&A with Fiona about the article, and it's well worth the read. You can also find that link in our show notes. You know, it's interesting. I think that someone like Fiona is a good voice to be having about these things because, in essence, she's kind of been viewed as a safe voice. And so the fact that, you know, a theme based on this podcast that we're doing today is having different views out there. The fact that you can have someone like Fiona get this view out there and, again, open it up to people challenging it and talking about it, that's the more important thing. But to me, I think that the most important thing out of what she's doing is, in essence, she's using her reputation to get this out there and to make it not so automatically dismissed. So we can actually talk about it and sink into it instead of other people just saying, oh, well, we don't need to listen to them.
Well, and Fiona's been presenting at the Time Out for Women event as well. She's admired, and she has a strong voice, and she has really strong views about things. But because she has that sweet British accent, she can say almost anything that she wants.
The accents get away with so much.
What struck me about this article of hers is how in line, in many ways, it is with the recent Gospel Topics essays on Joseph Smith and women and priesthood and Heavenly Mother. You know, they had these 2 essays out recently on that. Mm-hmm. And, it's pretty clear that Fiona goes much further than the Gospel Topics essays do, which they play it pretty safe, pretty conservative, understandably, coming from the church. But there's still a lot of areas where I saw plenty of overlap.
Let's talk about some of the new releases from this month. Stephen, you want to kick us off?
Okay, sure. First of all, we have from the Religious Studies Center, it's A Historian in Zion, the autobiography of Andrew Jensen, the assistant church historian. This was edited by Rita Nielsen and R. Mark Melville. Interesting about this, this was actually published back in, I think, like the 1950s, maybe. So this is a republishing, I guess, an updated version in that now that it's being edited by these historians, it includes historical notes and citations and helpful material in that way to sort of orient you towards who Andrew Jensen was and why he was important, just to give our listeners an idea of why he's important, why you should read this. Andrew Jensen, again, going back to polygamy, he was very influential in gathering historical sources on Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage. Interviews and affidavits from wives and others that he had, sort of tracked down. So he absolutely has a fascinating role to play in the history of, modern church history and how it's being written and how it's being developed. So for those interested in that, you'll definitely want to take a look at this.
And for those who aren't familiar with Reed Nielsen is the current assistant church historian. So it's kind of fitting. Great Kofford Books released Writing Ourselves, Essays on Creativity, Craft, and Mormonism by Jack Harrell. Jack Harrell is a creative writing professor at Brigham Young University, Idaho. And this book is written to writers, to people who have the creative spark. His book goes much further than just giving writing advice, however. It really is kind of about our overall view and paradigm. So he gets into a lot of philosophy, he gets into theology, he gets into things like nihilism versus determinism, and whether you consider yourself to be a writer, or whether you just enjoy reading, or whether you just enjoy thinking. It's a great book.
Jack does teach at my alma mater, BYU Idaho. He's very, very well known within the English department. He is very well thought of. Everybody that I knew, my wife was an English major, everyone that I knew that had one of his classes really, really came away from his classes loving what he was doing and how he was going about teaching. So, like you said, it's a different way to write about something, and I'm always interested in people that are going to approach it differently.
Thomas F. Rogers just released Let Your Hearts and Minds Expand, Reflections on Faith, Reason, Charity, and Beauty. This is by the Maxwell Institute. It's their newest volume in their Living Faith series. The punchline here with his book is it's part memoir, part theological reflection, part apologetics, and part sort of philosophical musing. Thomas F. Rogers is a former professor at BYU. He taught in the Russian department, so he taught like Russian literature and language and culture for years and years. He's also a playwright. He's a very notable Latter-day Saint playwright. He doesn't really pull his punches when he sort of identifies what he thinks are some issues in Mormon culture that we have to sort of confront and address. But he never, this isn't some sort of anti-Mormon expose thing. Like, you can tell he's coming from a place of faith, a place of charity, of wanting to, in other words, he's pointing out these issues in Mormon culture and history because he thinks we can do better and he wants to help improve us as a people and as a church. Finally, we have Glorious in Persecution by Martha Bradley Evans. I guess you guys mentioned this, you were saying on your last episode, so I'll just take one more minute. I think it's worth noting. I'm in the middle of it right now, and it's actually very, very good. I'm really enjoying it. I'm especially enjoying her treatment on Nauvoo polygamy, which again, sort of what I said before, it's great to have more women voices participating in this conversation, and I think she does a pretty good job addressing Nauvoo polygamy from a very responsible and very nuanced and interesting way. It's really easy with the subject to either be like just over the top apologetic or over the top critical and anti-Mormon, and both of those pitfalls should be avoided. I think she does a very good job looking very nuanced and balanced at this, trying to see what's actually going on here with Nauvoo polygamy. And so that's a definite highlight for me, a plus. There's other great things about the book, but that's just one that stood out to me that maybe can whet people's appetite.
And let's get into some of the recent events that have taken place, as well as some of the upcoming events. The Mormon History Association held their annual conference in Snowbird, Utah this month, and I'm going to go ahead and let Stephen give us some of the highlights.
Lots to highlight, but I'll just pick a couple things. So we had a panel on race discussions or race relations, Mormon and racial history. You had Paul Reeve and some others that were, Russell Stevenson was another scholar who was on this panel. And so one highlight from this panel that stood out to me, somebody mentioned that if you look at the history of minorities, ethnic and racial minorities in Mormonism, there was never a time, since the time Elijah Abel was ordained to the priesthood in, 1837, I think, Ever since then, there has never been a time in Mormon history where there hasn't been some Black or African American member of the church who had the priesthood in some part of the world or another, either in the United States or in the Caribbean or in Africa or in South America. You had people, racial minorities, Black racial minorities, who had the priesthood at one point or another. And that was absolutely fascinating to look at that history.
Yeah.
Another panel was on the sexual violence in the Missouri War. The big keynote here was Andrea Rabke Moss, who's a professor up there at BYU, Idaho. And she, sort of made some waves recently by announcing that she believes she has historical evidence that indicates that Eliza R. Snow was gang raped during the Missouri War by some of the mobbers. And, this set off all sorts of interesting discussions. And she followed up with her presentation at MHA on this. And not just focusing on Eliza R. Snow's, alleged sexual assault, but rather on the experience of other Mormon women during the Mormon War in Missouri. She mentioned the fact that we tend to lionize people like Joseph Smith and Parley P. Pratt and other church leaders during this time who were all men, and yet Mormon women who were suffering during this time tend to get very little notice. And then we had, of course, the Council of 50. This was the big one that everybody was all excited about. They had a panel with Richard Bushman, Jan Ships, Richard Bennett, and Paul Reeve were all there. And they even included, this was pretty fun, they included a handout with an excerpt from the Council 50 minutes. And so people who were there were able to take home an excerpt and look at it for themselves. The main takeaway that I got from it was this. First of all, there's been this air of mystery and intrigue around the Council 50 minutes. And what they've all said was, there's nothing in there that we didn't already know. What this is doing is it's providing clarity, it's illuminating things, it's illustrating things, but there's no groundbreaking, shocking revelation that's going to bring Mormonism to its knees or anything like that, or totally upend how we look at Mormon history. There is a lot of sensitive stuff because this is a sensitive part of Mormon history, but it's nothing crazy, nothing that's going to, shake people up too much. And then finally, we had Don Bradley, Ugo Perigo, and Brian Hales talking about Joseph Smith's marriage to Sylvia Sessions, including the big question of, was Sylvia's daughter Josephine one of Joseph Smith's children?
I feel like we need a drum roll before we make that announcement.
Right, yeah. Okay, so yeah. So this was a big debate, okay, or a big discussion because, Josephine claimed in an affidavit in 1915, she said that her mother on her deathbed said that she was Joseph Smith's daughter. For years, we just sort of took that at face value. And the big question was this therefore an example of sexual polyandry? And Ugo Perigo, our favorite Italian geneticist, he came in and he did DNA testing on Josephine Lyon's descendants and on Joseph Smith's descendants. She is not Joseph Smith's daughter.
Dun, dun, dun.
Right? Get Maury Povich out here. You are not
I was just going to say, you are not the father.
Yeah, that's right. And so, she's not. And Ugo feels pretty confident about this, that genetically it just doesn't hold up. She was not Joseph Smith's daughter. She was, in fact, the daughter of Windsor Lyon, who was Sylvia Sessions' first husband. So this just throws open a whole new can of worms. We now have to discuss what's going on with their relationship. What does Sylvia mean when she said you're Joseph Smith's daughter? What kind of marriage did Sylvia Sessions have with Joseph Smith? What kind of a sealing or plural marriage was this? These are all questions that we're still hashing out and still debating. But for the meantime, it seems pretty clear that genetically, we've cracked the case. She's not Joseph Smith's daughter.
So another big part of MHA is the awards, and this year's Leonard Arrington Award went to Michael Quinn. The selection chairman, Thomas G. Alexander, said his 1987 book, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, was a prize-winning, imaginative, and path-breaking study of the relationship between traditional folk magic and early Mormonism. Alexander also went on to praise his books about President J. Reuben Clark and also his 3 books on the Mormon hierarchy. And even though controversy surrounded same-sex dynamics among 19th century Americans, a Mormon example, the book broke new ground in Mormon studies, Alexander said.
And this really warms my heart. This is a long time coming. Now, there are book awards and there are article awards. For the sake of time, we're just going to cover the book awards, but I will link to all of the awards in the show notes if you're interested in seeing what articles and dissertations and other things have won awards this year from the Mormon History Association. But diving into the books, the Best Book Award was given to Paul Reeve for Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, published by the University of Utah Press. Nobody was surprised by this. This book came out and really became the high bar for Mormon studies. It's theoretically rich, it's easy to read, it's enjoyable, it's illustrative.
Yeah, I would say that one was my favorite book of all of last year, mostly because I had never even contemplated the fact that people would view Mormons as a separate race.
The standards of whiteness was far more than just skin color. Honorable mention was Thomas Carter's Building Zion, The Material World of Mormon Settlement, published by the University of Minnesota Press. Best biography went to Ronald Romig, Eighth Witness, the biography of John Whitmer, published by John Whitmer Books. I tell you, Ron Romig, he is another one of those legends within the Mormon History Association. He's a past president of MHA, and he's also heavily involved with the John Whitmer Historical Association. He's published several books, but this is the biggest volume that he's published, and it's been a long time coming for this. Honorable mention for Best Biography went to Michael Hicks for the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, a biography. The Best Documentary Editing, again, no surprise, went to Royal Skousen and Robin Scott Jensen, editors of the Revelations and Translations, Volume 3 from the Joseph Smith Papers, the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, published by the Church Historians Press. Mentioning once again our relationship with the Community of Christ historians, this would not have been possible if it wasn't for people like Ron Romig, who began working with Royal Skousen and Robert Scott Jensen with the manuscripts that they had of that printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon. The best first book went to David Hall, A Faded Legacy, Amy Brown Lyman, and Mormon Women's Activism, 1872 to 1959, published by the University of Utah Press. When you talk about Mormon history, this is the period that I'm mostly interested in, is the early 20th century on up until about the Cold War era. Amy Brown Lyman was a significant figure when we talk about Mormonism moving from its polygamous roots, from its Utah-centric roots into the mainstream of America. I would say that Amy Brown Lyman is one of those key figures that helped us make that transition. Another event to bring up, Adam Miller posted a program for this year's Mormon Theology Seminar Conference. It was held June 15th in the Chapel of the Great Commission at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. This is really where it's at right now for Mormon theology.
2 weeks ago, we had the Richard Bushman Colloquium. This was put on by the Maxwell Institute at BYU, and a forthcoming book will be published, and the videos will be posted online pretty soon. Joseph Stewart over at the Juvenile Instructor summarized it this way. He said the colloquium, held in Richard Bushman's honor, it represents a new approach to Mormon apologetics focused on contextualization and providing facts while primarily speaking the language of faith. And to give you an idea of what he means here, you just need to look at who is presenting at this. Taro Givens, Matthew Bowman, J. Spencer Fluman, and Matt Groh, David Holland, and others. But he also had a number of non-Mormon presenters as well. Ann Taves, she was there. She's worked very closely with Maxwell Institute recently. Laurie Maffley Kipp, another non-Mormon historian, and some others. And so you can see this move towards more sort of inclusive discussions about Mormonism from both Mormon and non-Mormon perspectives. And so this was very much anticipated, and I'm sure the book is going to be wonderful when it comes out. So look for that in the future. But in the meantime, looks like videos will be going up pretty soon. You can check it out that way.
Speaking of videos, the video recording of Greg Prince's author event at Benchmark Books on June 20th discussing his biography of Leonard Arrington is now available to watch. It's uploaded on YouTube, and we'll include that in the show notes. Again, I've been gushing a lot recently about the Leonard Arrington biography. If you like what Greg Prince did with the David O. McKay biography, taking these snippets of McKay's life and taking certain themes and writing a chapter about it, you're really going to like the Leonard Arrington biography.
Looking ahead at some events, the Maxwell Institute and Greg Kofford Books will be co-hosting a panel event at Written Vision on July 21st to discuss Julie Smith's 2 forthcoming releases, Apocalypse, Reading Revelation 21 and 22, and As Iron Sharpens Iron, Listening to the Various Voices of Scripture. The panel will include Julie Smith, Joseph Spencer, and a couple of others to be announced, and they'll be discussing the 2 books as well as academic and devotional readings of the New Testament.
And finally, the 2016 Sunstone Symposium will be held July 27th through 30th at the University of Utah. A few of the program highlights: the opening Smith Pettit Lecture on Wednesday, July 27th will be given by John Turner, author of Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet, and Mormon Jesus. I believe this one is going to be free to the public. On Thursday, the 28th, there will be a Q&A session held with Reza Aslan and Judith Friedman. Reza is the best-selling author of Zealot and No God But God, and Judith is an American novelist who frequently deals with Western and Mormon themes. The Why We Stay session will be held on Friday the 29th and will feature Dan Witherspoon, Sidney Kaiser Olson, Bill Reel, Jerry Harwell, and Eric Samuelson. And also on Friday, a session titled Making Mormonism Mine, Claiming Space Within the Faith will feature a stellar panel that includes Carolyn Pearson, Robert Kirby, Lori Winder-Stromberg, Fernando Rogelio Gomez, and Kathy Stokes. Complete program details will be linked in the show notes. And again, I believe the Smith Pettit lecture on the 27th with John Turner is free and open to the public.
And that wraps us up for this month in Mormon Studies. I'd like to thank Stephen Smoot for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, as always, Brandt.
You got it.
We'll see you next month.